Stage 1 of the Marvel Rivals Ignite tournament wasn't just any other competition. As the first LAN tournament for Marvel Rivals, Ignite Stage 1 gave us all a brief snapshot of what to expect out of Marvel Rivals Esports moving forward, as do the scoreboards. However, what if I told you that the true heroes weren't the players with the highest individual stats, but those who truly understood what it takes to win and played as one cohesive team? Today, we're going to delve deep into the hidden statistics that led RAD Esports to become the unrivaled champions of Marvel Rivals' first LAN tournament, proving that the secret to victory isn't revealed through the scoreboard, but in what those stats truly represent: a team's ability to work together and quickly adapt to changes in play, allowing you to uncover the hidden insights that separate the heroes from the superheroes and how to win in your own games. And so, without further ado, I welcome you all to Marvel Rivals 101, Scoreboard Analysis, with the aim of teaching you how to win at Marvel Rival. We'll be doing this through an analysis of the Ignite Stage 1 tournament statistics. Devise a sort of experiment where we're going to be analyzing the stats of the 10 teams that played during the Stage 1 LAN tournament, and from this data, we're going to be developing what I've called teamwork stats, which we're going to talk more about later. But for a brief overview of what these teamwork stats could be, these could be stats such as KDA, which is the kills death average, the kills per damage, and also the healing per assist. And this is done to measure how the team performs rather than individual performances. And so this is going to be calculating player and team averages for each game played and then also applying it to look at their overall performances. I've gone through these statistics for every single game and broken the stats down and then made these calculations for every single player and then standardized them across both the individual roles on the team as well as overall. So we're going to be able to look at each players as role duos and then overall as a team, and we'll sort of talk more about unpacking like which numbers are good and which stats are good for each role, each team, and each player. Additionally, these stats will also be used to analyze the play style of the teams and provide critiques for improvements, because from my personal vantage point, I think that there's no one size fits all for the different stats and the team performances. I think it needs to be individualized based on both how the players play and also how they play together. The main goal of this is sort of to demonstrate the importance of working together with your teammates and being able to adapt to changes in play style and team comp. So that's what a lot of my suggestions for improvement and discussing around that is going to be aimed towards, how these stats can benefit these specific players or you who are watching this who might want to learn from these players. Encourage everyone to pay attention to the sort of hidden story that the scoreboard can tell, because I think there's been a lot of debate on whether or not the scoreboard is actually useful or not, and I think that by analyzing the statistics that it gives us in combination with one another actually will make it a lot more useful for analysis. It's very important to outline the sort of limitations of both the data set and this experiment at large. Data is collected from Ignite Stage 1, specifically from that LAN tournament, and because of the structure, the number of games is really inconsistent between the teams, and this is an important thing to point out because some teams only played as few as 4 games versus another team that played 29 games. For the team that played 29 games, there's a lot more numbers that give us better overview of what their average performance is like, whereas if a team has only played 4 games, there's really not a lot of detail about playstyle, so it's very hard to make definitive statements about this is how they play, and because there just isn't enough information to really make those firm statements, whereas I feel a lot more confident in my sort of assessment of the teams who played more games because there's more data there to judge how accurate their performance was. In addition to this, there's also pick and bans as well, and I didn't really go over that just because I thought it would be too complicated, but whether or not a certain player was targeted in the ban phase could really affect how they played in a certain game, and so this is why I developed something that's called adjusted averages, which is basically trying to account for inconsistencies in individual player performances. So like I said before, targeted bans can be one of those examples. So I specifically pointed out the players Speedery and Terra from Envy and 100 Thieves because they are 2 of the top performing players, and I found that there were a couple of games where they had much lower stats, but when you kind of look at this in light of the ban phase, it was largely because they were targeted. There's also times where players were playing off of their normal role. So Pokey and Cal, who were from Citadel and Envy, were players who oftentimes played off their role, and I believe both of them actually played all three roles. They're mainly DPS, but obviously in those cases you can't really judge how effective Cal is at playing DPS based on the amount of damage he had as a strategist in one game. When those kind of showed up, I did try to maybe adjust the averages a little bit, and the same goes for when trying to calculate the healing averages for when the teams were playing triple support as well, because typically they didn't start out playing triple support and they made the adjustments later on, so it wouldn't be really fair to do like a 10-minute average or when they only played 5 minutes in said game. There's also times when the teams were unevenly matched, and I think that this is largely the 2 game series that were played against the team GenG, which was the lowest placed team in this tournament. I'll kind of talk a little bit about this more, but specific in the games against Nova, if Nova's stats were not adjusted to account for how dominant their performance was in this game, their stats would be like some of the best in the entire tournament, which obviously isn't true because they were the second last place team, which isn't, you know, an insult against either of these teams. Did try and sort of for what I thought was a bit maybe unfair or inconsistent, because Nova's performance in the other games wasn't consistent with their performance against GenG. While there is a sort of formula to determine what's called standard deviation, which is typically determining the average difference between numbers in a particular data set, I'm not good at math, so I just decided to eyeball it. So I gave a little example here and say like this was our data set. I would take out the 4, the 32, and the 37 because I was kind of basing things on like if something was 5 over or 5 under, I would take that number out because to me that means that the performance is inconsistent with the rest of the average. So in this case, 4 is 5 numbers smaller than 9, and then 32 is 7 numbers above 25, and then 37 is 5 numbers before 32. So I would take out this 4, at least the 37, and most likely the 32. Limitation is that I had a very limited access to the stats because I'm not someone who has behind the scenes access to the more in depth of the scoreboard that belongs to the teams and like NetEase. And I also personally didn't feel like reviewing all of the game footage to come up with these stats. So like would be time played on hero. So like I mentioned before with players playing off role, the time spent on the hero would have been a really valuable statistic to have, because when I was trying to account for this, I would just kind of eyeball it based on what I thought about the number. So it might not be the most accurate and reflective statistic, and be damage blocked versus damage mitigated. And how I kind of conceptualize this is thinking about characters with shields, like how much are they blocking with their shield and how much damage are they taking on their person. This is something that would be really useful for measuring how effective a certain player is, because obviously you want to take as little damage as possible, but blocking damage with shields is really helpful for the team overall. Another limitation is that I decided to standardize these stats per 10 minutes, and so how I did this was basically go through all the stats from the game. I then divided it by the amount of time spent in the game and then multiplied that by 10. It might not have been the most time effective. I thought personally that this would be the best way to get an accurate reading on what the average performance that can be standardized and then analyzed. So all of the numbers that we're going to be looking at are averages per 10 minutes and not averages per game, because the average that you're going to have in a game that's 17 minutes long is going to be a lot different than the average that you're going to have in a game that's long. Additionally, different stat numbers are good for different characters and play styles, and this can affect the team stats overall. So for example, Dive I think tends to have a bit lower damage, usually because they're able to attack the supports from behind, and typically when you're killing off the supports before, you can then get the rest of the team down pretty quickly. Overall, there's just going to be less damage being done because it's going to be easier to kill your target. Similar Similarly, in a 3 support comp, there tends to be a little bit lower healing just because you have a third. Yes, in a lot of cases where triple support is even being used, there is a lot of damage being done. Typically, one of those supports is usually just to provide a little bit of extra healing and then still do damage. So this is why you see a lot of like Ultron, Adam, Mantis as that third support play. And then similarly for a specific character one, Invisible Woman has a shield as a support character, and this means that she tends to have a lot higher of a damage block statistic, which I think would be more concerning in a different strategist pick, because as a strategist you want to be taking as little damage as possible. Scoreboard stats are all standardized and don't show the value of clutch plays, such as getting a kill in overtime would be a lot more valuable to the team than getting a kill at the beginning of the game. Not that that isn't valuable, but in those kind of moments, that's when things matter most. Kills on strategists could also be something as well, because by taking out that back line, you're preventing the team from getting healing. It's also not going to show up on the scoreboard. To calculate these more complex stats, you would need to sort of rewatch the entire game, and I'm not going to do that because I already spent hours working on this already. Regional playstyles actually differ, and so we're going to touch upon this issue a bit later and discuss it as we continue through the stat. And then the last limitation is that I calculated everything here manually, and I'm not good at math, so there are bound to be mistakes. There are some times that I use different processes to determine the averages. Just keep that in mind, that these are not by any means like official stats. These are ones that I was doing on my own, and I haven't really had anyone to bounce off things with. So if there are any mistakes and you notice them, please be kind about pointing at the stats I'm measuring. So I've broken it down into standard stats, which are the stats that Marvel Rivals gives you on the scoreboard, and these are ones that everyone who plays the game should be familiar with. And then also the teamwork metrics, which are ones that I designed myself. Kills, deaths, assists, final hits, damage, damage blocked, and healing. And then these are the sort of acronyms or symbols that I use. And then the teamwork metrics, the first one was kills, death average, KDA, which is kills for each death. Damage per kill, which is damage / K. How much damage to secure kills, basically. So this is measuring how effective the player is at getting kills. I think this is most important for DPS in particular, because the more damage that you're doing typically means that the target you're doing the damage against is getting healed, which in turn will allow the strategist to sort of build their support ults a lot better. Determines whether or not you're able to strategize and pick the right sort of target to focus on. Similarly, the damage per final hits is specifically looking at the damage required for independent kills, so it's sort of measuring reliance on the team versus individual contribution. It's sort of a bit of flexibility, but I think for the most part this is used to gauge how effective the DPS is in particular about actually securing the kills, because once again, if you're doing a lot of damage but you're not getting final hits and you're not getting kills off of them, you're generating more ult charge for the enemy team, which impacts your team more negatively, I would think. Damage blocked per death, so this is how much damage is blocked before they die. This is one that I had a lot of struggle with. I think highlights why there needs to be a difference between damage blocked versus damage mitigated, because for the most part I think that DPS and strategists should not be taking as much damage, whereas a tank can take a lot more damage but should be blocking more of that damage with things like shields as opposed to their body, though of course different tanks are made with different play styles. Healing per assist, which is basically how much healing to get an assist, so this is measuring how effective the strategist is at strategizing and how they can use healing and aid the team a lot more. And then there's also the healing per total team death, so this is how much healing is done before a teammate dies, and to test effectiveness of the strategist and get a good reading on whether or not the team itself is taking too much damage, and also how to mitigate this. Some of the caveats to this: that healing targets can be harder in certain comps, so it's I think also a good way to measure whether or not a team is more aggressive or defensive, and also when switch the approach as well, because if your team is dying a lot more than you can keep up with healing, that sort of indicates that I think you need to start playing a lot more defensively. But I also think with teams that have more aggressive play styles, this stat should be higher, and the same goes for assist as well, because if you're going to be playing more aggressively, you want the whole team to mobilize around that kind of play style so that the supports are actually contributing to getting kills and getting damage on targets as well. So healing per player, so this is the amount of strategist healing, and then it's divided by 5.5, with 5 counting for the other players and then 0.5 for themselves, because most strategists do have a certain amount of self-healing capacity, and this is supposed to measure how much healing is being received by each player. Obviously, this is a standardized mechanic and isn't going to reflect the fact that typically tanks get healed a lot more than DPS, but is more so meant to look at whether or not the strategist is able to keep up with the average amount of damage that different players on their team are going to be taking. The next stat, which is healing per damage blocked, is also meant to measure this, and so this is meant to measure how much of the damage taken is healed and also measure the efficiency of the healers. But once again, it's a bit inconclusive because damage blocked does not distinguish between what is blocked by shields and what is blocked by the actual bodies. Obviously, the damage that is blocked by shields does not need to be healed, so it's going to kind of skew those stats, but overall I think having a higher number in this is probably better. Healing per team death strategist only, so this is going back to that healing per team total team death stat, and this is measuring the efficiency of the healers in a 2-2-2 comp, because overall this is how the game is meant to be played. That does not mean that there's anything wrong with playing triple strategist, and indeed what we're seeing right now is triple strategist in the meta, and this is most likely what we're going to see a lot in stage 2 at the LAN tournament. But the game is designed to be played as a 2-2-2, so I think it is useful to have a statistic on whether or not the strategists are able to actually perform to this level. And then damage block per death vanguard only, and then also damage block per death duelists only. And so this is to get a closer look where damage blocked is coming from. So specifically in the case of vanguards, they're meant to take a lot more damage and also have shields that versus the individual body damage. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe there are any duelists that have an official shield. I do think some have like a capacity to give like extra bonus health, like Iron Fist for example, but I think that's counted as healing as opposed to damage blocked per shield. But it's more so to get a measure at whether or not the healing per player is able to substantiate the amount of damage that the duelist player is going to be taking. Assist strategist only, so strategist is the main role that gets assist and is more efficient for team play rather than the healing stat. How the strategist is actually combining with the team to set up plays, also prioritizing targets that need healing, that enables them to get kills and support the team overall. This isn't to say that I think the healing stat is useless, but in this case it's meant to measure the offensive production of the strategist on the team. Now, before we get into fully unpack the in Marvel Rivals, from my personal perspective, especially in the pro scene, I think that each role can be broken down into offensive and defensive play styles and can be based either on character picks or individual and team play styles. Why the game is supposed to be played in a 2-2-2 comp is because there's supposed to be a more offensive and defensive oriented player for each role. To start off with Vanguard, the offensive role for this would typically be a dive tank or someone who plays a lot more mobile. So this player would be more likely to be pushing the objective and sort of pushing against the enemy team. They would most likely have higher damage and also lower damage blocked, as they're more likely going to be focused on generating offense and pushing people away from the objective rather than, holding down, because holding down is actually the role of the defensive Vanguard. They're largely going to be staying on point or at least close nearby. They might be the ones peeling for the supports if the offensive Vanguard is not the dive character, because the dive has a lot of mobility, and especially if you're playing a character like Venom, you can get from the map in literal split seconds. Whereas I think if you're playing offensive defensive Vanguards that don't have that same mobility, I think it's more often that you're going to see the defensive Vanguard making that just because they're closer. I think overall they're going to have a little bit lower damage and higher damage blocked, and typically they are a shield tank, but there are sometimes times as well that you might see a shield tank play the more offensive role. That sort of depends more on the player's personal playstyle and which characters they prefer. The duelist is kind of the hardest one to measure whether or not it's offensive and defensive, because this role is the offensive role. The offensive duelist is just going to be playing a lot more aggressively. They're going to be flanking more and often are going to have more deaths due to making riskier playing decisions. And in my opinion, this is the role where communicating with your team is most essential, because you're oftentimes going to be playing a lot of the game on your own. So you need to be communicating with your team, such as your supports, to tell them where you are going to be so that they can heal you, and also communicating with your vanguard so that they know when to push up to try and help you. Defensive, sort of similar to the defensive vanguard, is going to play a lot closer to the objective, and they're going to also try and peel for supports to help them out. And this would also be the player that most likely is going to switch to triple support. In my opinion, the duelist is more dependent on character pick. Think of the defensive duelist as being a character that has a lot more long range. So a lot of the hit scan and sort of projectile characters tend to fall in this category because they can get damage done from a larger distance, whereas a lot of the sort of melee and poke DPSs are a lot more dependent on the aggressive sort of offensive style. This same holds true for the strategist. The offensive strategist is going to take on a role similar to sort of a playmaker, meaning that they're going to play a little bit closer to the action and have a larger role in setting up kills, and also as a result have higher assists. The defensive DPS and a triple support comp will also play similar to this, so you will kind of see the two of them playing a lot closer together. So this is where you would see a lot of the Adam Mantis duo, for example. And then the defensive strategist is going to be more of your traditional sort of heal bot, meaning that they're going to be staying on the objective or even holding from behind. They typically, I think, have a lot more of a responsibility for both scouting and ult tracking, because they have the capacity to see everything that's going on because they're playing the furthest back. They're also going to be the primary healer, so their focus is going to be on healing and communicating things to their team as opposed to trying to set up. I also wiles, and so I think this is really helpful for both trying to understand the players' play styles and also understanding your own play style. Also, kind of helps to frame how to sort of apply improvements to your specific role. For the vanguards, I think overall the defensive vanguards tend to be more shield oriented, so I say Magneto and Groot are the two most defensive in my mind, and also the two that we see the most that fulfill this role played in the Ignite tournament. Though I'd also like to add that Emma and Strange can also fit into this. They are also both shield tanks, obviously, but I do think that they have a lot more offensive carry potential, and there are a lot of times where we see the offensive oriented vanguard on a team play one of these two characters, especially if either Magneto or Groot is banned out. I personally also think that Hulk and maybe Thing could fit into the either category as well. The offensive one is more based around the dive tanks, so Captain America and Venom were obviously very big picks during this tournament, and I think we've been seeing a lot more players orientating towards trying to play this dive role, specifically with Venom in this current meta. Angela obviously fits into this role as well. As for Penny Park, I would put her in the either category because she does have this sort of defensiveness of the nest somewhat, but I do think she can get a lot of value offensively through the mines. I don't know how useful she actually is in pro play because I don't play in high ranks at all, so I have no clue. I know there's a lot of people who clown on Penny, but she does seem to dominate in lower ranks, and I think it is because she has a lot more offensive carry potential in those lower ranks due to just lack of player awareness. Once again, I think there is some fluidity to these playstyles as well. TTK actually plays a lot of Magneto, which is the defensive oriented role, yet he is one of the most offensive oriented players I think in the entire tournament, which we're going to discuss in a lot more detail. As for the DPS though, this is the one that I had I think the most trouble with because I don't usually play DPS. I'm actually a strategist main, so take my estimations with that caveat in mind. mind. Additionally, there's also a lot more DPS characters in the game, and I obviously couldn't include them all into this slide, but I tried to select from ones that I saw a lot within the Ignite tournament. So our first category is the offensive role. This one I think tends to be more the melee and poke characters. I think some that we saw a lot from were Wolverine and Psylocke. I think Psylocke maybe to a lesser extent than Wolverine is offensive because Psylocke does have a bit of range to her ability, but once again, I think a lot of players tend to play her a lot more offensively. Bucky, I think, is another one. Defensive oriented is more so characters that have a lot of range, so Hela as a hit scan character is someone who can play with a lot of range, and Namor as well with his squids, and also the fact that he is a projectile allows you to kind of play a lot more closer to the objective, and you don't really have to get as far into the action. There's also a category for some mixed. I think the mixed category tends to be the most dominant characters. I put Torch and Phoenix here. Torch was almost completely banned out, and I think it's largely because he has such utility, because he's allowed to both play offensively and defensively and can reposition between those play styles very, very quickly due to the fact that he has a speed-based ability as well as a flyer, which makes it a lot harder to hit him. Phoenix also fits into this because while she is a hit scan, she also has a very useful melee, and a lot of people like to use that sort of melee cancel technique to get a lot of damage out of her. I also think Star-Lord could possibly fit in this as well because one of his main utilities is the fact that he's able to sort of do the flanking that the offensive Vanguard does, but he's also, once again, like Torch, a character who has a lot of mobility that allows him to play defensive would be triple support. And this is basically just which characters do we tend to see from the DPS player in a triple support comp, which is typically Adam or Ultron, which are characters that are more based around getting offensive value. The strategist roles, if you notice here, I gave Invisible Woman these little hearts around her because she is my favorite character and the one that I play the most, so I gave her all these little hearts because I love her. Anyways, the first category is the Playmaker, and this was the offensive-oriented strategist. So these are characters that are going to be more focused on providing offensive help to the team and also setting up plays. So Invisible Woman has the very useful skill of being able to pull and push enemies, which can really help to set up kills for your team. She also has a limited range on her ability, so she does need to play closer to the action to be able to actually get that value. Loki is similar, where he has his clones, so you can position your clones a lot more strategically to help out a lot more with offensive production. I think there's a lot more setting up going on with these two characters. The Healbot character, and I feel a bit of a need to put a caveat here because I think people are going to be sort of offended at hearing Luna Snow be called a Healbot, but this isn't necessarily that she doesn't get offensive output. It's more so to say that her play style is more defensive oriented, meaning that because she is a hit scan character, she's not going to be up in the action the same way that Loki and Invisible Woman need to be able to get value based on their kits. Luna Snow's kit is designed for her to be able to heal and do damage from a large distance, which puts her more similar to characters like Hela and Namor that we talked about with the defensive duelist. So it doesn't mean that she's not getting offensive output, it just means that her play style is more defensive oriented. Rocket, on the other hand, tends to be the lowest damage support, but he does have the very useful skill of the resurrection beacon, which I think has made him a mainstay in the current turbo support meta. The mixed play style is ones where they both combine the playmaker and the heal bot, and I think this depends more on how the individual player decides to play them. I think some people are going to have an issue with Cloak and Dagger being in this section, but my perception of this is that Dagger is the heal bot, Cloak is the playmaker, because Cloak, what his ability does is actually gives a damage boost, and so that kind of plays into the playmaker tactics that both Loki and Invisible Woman do, because you have to be very selective of where you're putting your terror cape and also timing it in the right way so that your team can get the most value out of the skill. But most of the time you are playing the game as Dag. I do think that there is more sort of strategizing behind it that's needed to really effectively pull off Cloak Cloak and Dagger, which is what we're able to see at the highest level of play. Jeff is similar. Obviously, there's been a lot of controversy about the different Jeff reworks, and I know that there's still people who are very, very upset about no longer being able to play flanking Jeff. I think I just have to put him in the mixed role just because of how varied the playstyles of different players are on this character, but I think overall, similar to Cloak and Dagger, the average playstyle for Jeff does tend to fall more in this heal bot category, but you can do the flanking, as well as I think his ult actually falls a lot more in the playmaker category, where you can very easily sort of strategically maneuver it to get certain players off. You can also use it at clutch times, like in overtime, to clear players from the point, so it is a very strategic ult. And then the last category is the triple support, so I think it's more often that you will see an Atom or a Mantis being played. Typically this will be your playmaker character switching off, because you're able to get a lot more offensive boost from one of these two characters. I think it's very rare to see the duelist play the Mantis role, for example, but I wouldn't put it past like that possibly happening, just because different players have different hero pools, and once again, we don't have a lot of data about things, and the next stage of the tournament is more so oriented towards the triple support play style, so I think we're going to have more conclusive results about which characters are more likely to be played in these situations than what we do now. Now, I also think that the regional play styles do have impact on the team play as well. This is the first ever LAN tournament, and so it's very, very difficult to account for different skill levels and play styles across the different regions. Part of why I created these teamwork stats was to try and account for how different regional play styles may affect the stats and the team's ability to win and adapt. And how this showed up when I was analyzing the stats is that I found that overall, the North American teams tended to have higher individual stats, but comparatively a bit lower on the teamwork end, whereas the EMEA teams tended to be more consistent with both standard and teamwork stats, with most stats being in the top 5. And then in contrast, the Asia and Oceania teams tended to be higher for teamwork and a bit lower for the standard stats. However, with all of this, it cannot be standardized due to the low sample size and the perspective lack in skill level, because I think it's no surprise to most people that the NA and EMEA teams did dominate this entire tournament, with most of their teams being in the top half, with the Asia and Oceania teams being in the lower half. And because of this, I also think that the way that we're measuring whether or not a stat is in the range of being good or good for the teamwork is different depending on the region, because the different teams play in a different style. Teamwork looks different between the regions. In NA, teamwork is centered around supporting the high damage dealers, whereas in EMEA, the focus is on mobilizing as an offensive unit, which often results in higher damage and KDAs for supports and vanguards comparative to their North American peers. Asia and Oceania similarly have the same playstyle as EMEA, but I do think that they're a bit less successful at it, and so this kind of makes me question a little bit if it might be a difference in skill. I also think that these teams tend to play a bit more defensively, so they do have a lot lower standardized stats than the EMEA teams and the North America teams do. And I did want to kind of broaden this topic a little bit, because I think this notion of collective and individual play is very interesting. However, there is next to no research on this specifically in relation to esports. There is some in relation to sports in particular, and even when I was outlining this, it reminded me a lot of a project that I did, which I wrote about the 1972 Summit Series, in which I compared how hockey in North America is played in separate offensive and defensive lines, but in the former Soviet Union, hockey was actually played as 5-man units, where you would have all your forwards and defensemen on the same line, and so you would always be playing with the same 5 players, whereas in the North America context, you would be switching up the offensive lines and defensive line. Kind of shows a bit of this difference in collective and individual play styles, and one that I do think applies to this situation as well, because in the NA teams, their teamwork is centered around maybe 1 or 2 players, whereas in the EMEA, it's focused more on the team as a whole, so they're playing sort of more so as that 5-man unit, where I think in the NA case, they're kind of playing a lot more on the 2-2-2 line basis. I did find one study that proposes what's called the game behavior scale, that is intending to measure if players are motivated more by individual individual or collective goals, such as getting higher individual stats or focus more on teamwork, and what behavior either causes or results from this chosen style. This particular article is more trying to create a survey to be able to answer these questions, but I do think it gives an interesting framework for how to apply notions of collective and individual play to the esports field. Additionally, and this is something that they discuss in that article, is the notion of collective versus individualist cultures. So from a cultural standpoint, NA tends to be a lot more individualistic. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone. Asia, on the other hand, is predominantly collectivist, while EMEA, which is composed of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, has a lot more variability depending on the nation and culture. However, I do believe most of the teams and players that we've seen so far have been largely European and predominantly Western European as well, so a little bit more individualist, but I don't think as far individualist as NA, but definitely more individualist than I think most of Asia is. But once again, there's a lot of debate on which cultures fall into that, which similarly takes us to our next slide, where I've outlined the two works that are sort of the seminal texts on this notion of individual and collectivism. So the first one is called Culture's Consequences by Gert Hofstede, and this was based on his observations that there was differences in work-related values depending upon the culture that the individual came from. Similarly, Harry Triandis's book Individualism and Collectivism builds upon Hofstede's work. This article, The Game Behavior Scale, Electronic Elaboration and Psychometric Evidence, is the article that I was referring to earlier, and this applies both Hofstede and Triandis's research into developing this scale. This second article here is called Sport Identity and Sport Participation, which is a cultural comparison between collective and individualistic societies, which is looking at how sport identity, which is how differs depending on whether or not they come from a collectivist or individualistic culture. Once again, this one is not about esports, but I do think it provides an interesting way of applying Hofstede and Triandis's research to the field of sports at large. And with all this, I think it would be very, very interesting to look at this moving forward to see if these observations hold true or if this is just me speculating on things that aren't true at all. But I do think it would be really interesting to analyze whether or not there is comparative differences between the different team and regional play styles, and how we can develop a statistical means of analyzing how these teams play differently and how that shows up on the scoreboard, which is the goal of this overall experiment. But I did want people to be aware of this as we go through, because once again, I think people tend to gravitate towards those very high skill players, but I think that just because the value that a player has towards their team doesn't show up on the scoreboard doesn't mean that it isn't there. And I think this provides an interesting framework that is important to keep in mind as we go through analyzing each of the individual teams, as you're going to see that some of these teams don't have as high personal stats but have a lot higher stats when it comes to teamwork. Alright, so before we get analyzing the actual stats, I have a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that I suck at math, and so there are bound to be mistakes with the analysis and also the stats as well. I also might not have used the best metrics, so if you have any criticism, feel free to leave it down below, but please be nice about it, because I have no clue about what I was doing going into this. I have no background in statistical analysis or in anything related to esports. Additionally, none of this is meant to be hate towards any team or player. I think they're all very, very good. This is no background in statistical analysis or in anything related to esports. Additionally, none of this is meant to be hate towards any team or player. I think they're all very, very good. This is strictly meant to try and look at their stats and analyze them to how it can both help them, their team, and also us to sort of learn and improve, because they are the best players in the world at this game. Kind of clarify things, I'm not very good at this game. My highest rank has been Platinum 2 and I play on console, so I'm not some authority on Marvel Rivals by any means. Additionally, some players have switched teams, or teams have changed their names, so I will be referring to team names and players as of Ignite Stage 1, but in some of my suggestions I will be commentating on some things such as switches that have happened to the teams and how those switches maybe have impacted things as well, or could impact things moving forward. Additionally, some of the teams have different different names. I think Ground Zero is no longer a team. RAD Esports is obviously now under Navi, and then there's also been some player switches, like Melio is no longer on the Navi team. He is playing on Citadel, and Sentinels has obviously had a lot of changes as well. So I will kind of talk about these things, but as it refers to player names and stuff like that and team names, I'm going to be using them as they were in stage 1. And then lastly, this is my first ever time doing like a video like this, so I don't know if I'm actually presenting things in the best way. If you have criticism about the presentation, just be nice about it. Getting into the details, the hypothesis behind this experiment is that the teamwork stats will be more accurate and better reflect the correct placements of the team during the tournament rather than the standardized stat. And so this teamwork stats will also help to understand and also analyze team and individual play styles to provide feedback and suggestions for improvement. This is also why I decided to do it per game as well, because I think it's breaking it down by game. We're able to look at where things worked really well for their play style, whether that's as a team or as an individual player, and also where things went really wrong as well. This gives us a more comprehensive overview of the player and the team. Most of the team averages will be calculated for each stat being measured, and then those ranks 1 to 10 will be averaged to create the total team average. While the teamwork stats are going to be more accurate, I don't think that they are going to fully show things largely between the two teams of Envy and RAD, because while RAD was the winner of the tournament overall, they were also coming in from the losers bracket, so I do think that that will have a impact on their stats. And so I think it is possible that Envy will end up being the best for the teamwork stats, despite the fact that they were in second place, whereas RAD was in first place, because overall RAD had to play more games to get to the same position as Envy. So I think that could impact things, but I'm not 100% sure. My predictions for things, and once again, want to repeat the disclaimer that this is not meant to be hate towards any of the teams or the players. The highest for kills was going to be Citadel. For deaths, it was going to be either RAD or OUG, so this would be the lowest amount of deaths. Assist, highest Envy. Final hits, highest Citadel. Damage, highest would be 100 Thieves. Damage blocked, highest would be 100 Thieves or Ground Zero. Healing, highest would be Citadel or 100 Thieves. KDA, highest was going to be RAD. Damage per kill, highest was going to be Citadel. Damage per final hit was going to be RAD. Highest. Damage blocked per death, highest either RAD or Citadel. Healing per total team death, highest Envy. Healing per assist, highest Envy. Total team deaths, the lowest would be either RAD or OUG. Healing per player, highest Citadel. Healing per damage blocked, highest percentage was going to be RAD. The worst teams, and once again, this isn't counting the GenG stats because I think their team wasn't ready for this tournament. Lowest kills were going to be either Nova or OUG. Or the highest deaths was going to be Citadel or Ground Zero. The lowest assist was going to be OUG. The lowest final hits was going to be Rejects or OUG. The lowest damage was going to be OUG. The lowest damage blocked was going to be Sentinels. Healing lowest was going to be Nova. KDA lowest Rejects. Damage per kill lowest was going to be 100 Thieves. Damage per final hits was going to be 100 Thieves. Damage blocked per deaths was going to be lowest was going to be Sentinels or Nova. Healing for total team death, lowest was going to be Rejects or Ground Zero. Healing per assist, lowest was going to be Sentinels. Healing per player, lowest was going to be Nova. And the healing per damage blocked percentage was lowest was going to be Sentinels. Now, to start off with our teams. I don't think GenG was ready for this tournament. They had the lowest stats for mostly every single category, both standardized and teamwork. I think they had a bit of a chance against Nova because they were a bit more similarly matched. And when I kind of watched that game, I did think that the game was a lot more competitive than I think the overall stats indicate. But once again, Nova did come out with a pretty clear and decisive win, which they weren't able to pull off against any other teams that they played. Working on their Vanguard lineup should be their priority, as they actually switched out Vanguard repetitively in this tournament. I think the strategists overall were probably their most solid point. They had pretty good healing numbers and were the only stats that were not actually last. But once again, their healing numbers were a lot higher because their team overall was taking a lot more damage as well. I think it's very, very difficult to get an accurate measure of their skills due to the structure of the tournament and also the teams that they played against, because I think they only played against GenG and RAD, which is very difficult because GenG is the lowest in the tournament, whereas RAD is the team that won the tournament. Overall, they had the lowest overall healing. I would guess that this had something to do with the fact that they struggled against RAD and had a much easier time against GenG. Their vanguards were pretty solid as well, ranking with the number 2 damage blocked overall and number 4 for damage blocked amongst vanguard. However, like we talked about at the beginning with the adjusted averages, I took out their games that they played against Nova because there was just such a stark skill gap. Is that they also played Invisible Woman as one of their strategists. This would up their damage blocked overall a lot more, so this is why their damage blocked overall is higher than their damage blocked amongst the vanguards. I think my overall sort of suggestion would be that they need to generate more offensive pressure. They had the second lowest damage, but they did have some decent stats for damage per kill and damage per final hit. Their healing per damage blocked was also number 3, so they do have a solid teamwork between the vanguard strategist duos, but I don't think they have enough capabilities to get a lot of offensive pressure. So here is the Nova player average. So this is the average per each player on this team. And as you can see over here, there are stats that have this A beside it, which means that they're adjusted. So here is Bobo, who is one of their duelist players, for example. And here they're like games against RAD. You can kind of see here that there's some numbers where it's just a lot higher, and also ones where they have very low deaths. For example, there are several times where the players had 0 deaths, for instance, and this was largely in their games against GenG, which if we look over here, actually bolster their KDAs exponentially. So for example, Bobo, if you count his game against his KDA is a 5.9, but if you take out those games it becomes a 4. Similar for Uwu, who's 7.6, but without the games from GenG it drops to 2.3. The games that they didn't play against GenG were played against RAD, so it's also like, is that even a fair metric to be judging them on how well they played against the best team in the tournament? And here's another one. I think this was one of the strategists. They had a 9.3 KDA. When adjusted for taking out the Nova games, they dropped to 1.6. So there's a huge statistical gap in how well they were able to perform in the games against GenG as opposed to how well they were able to perform against RAD, which makes it very, very difficult to actually come up with an authentic read player average performance. And here are the most commonly played characters for the individual members of the team. I originally was going to go back and add in their names, but I forgot to do that, so apologies to any of the players if you are seeing this and feel offended. This was not intentional and is not meant to slight anyone. I know the players from the NA and the EMEA teams a lot better because I actually watched those through the playoff stages, so this is mainly directed towards any of the Asia or Oceania teams. The Vanguards, the first one here, Strange and Emma, so this was kind of what we were talking about the mixed play style. I do think they tended to play more of the defensive role because on the flip side their other Vanguard was most often played Cap and Venom, which were the dive tanks and obviously do tend to be more offensive oriented. The DPS as well. I think both of them played a bit more in that aggressive role. Bobo played a lot of Psylocke. I think they did pretty well for getting like final hits in particular, which was the offensive role, whereas Uwu, the other duelist, did kind of tend to play a bit more on that defensive end with Star-Lord, who was one of the mixed characters that we talked about, and then Adam Warlock, who was one of the triple support. The two healers, one largely played Cloak and Invisible Woman, and then the other one largely played Una Snow or Invisible Woman, and like what we talked about before, that they did have a lot more higher damage blocked, and that's largely because they almost always had an Invisible Woman on the team, which isn't a bad thing. Obviously, I'm wearing my sweater today. it's just going to affect the stats differently. Moving forward, we have Sentinels, which, given that they were the winning team from the NA region, I think overall they had a rather disappointing performance. I think overall there was a lot of disconnect on the team. I don't want to get into it, but the players have come out and said that there were some issues going on internally, as well as we've seen players on that team change as well. I think they also struggled a lot because of the changes to the meta, largely the loss of the res comp, a team up, which they relied, I think, a lot on. And I think this kind of resulted in a lack of overall coordination that, for me in particular, was between the vanguards and supports, both together and also separately. So, for example, we saw a lot of double support ults, and this is still consistently a problem with Sentinel. And so I would also, based on this, kind of caution Sentinels and other teams moving forward to not rely so much on team ups like res comp, because res comp did make it so that you could play a lot more risky with players being able to be resurrected. And I do think in some way having Rocket as that triple support in the triple support meta does sort of enable this as well. But I do think it's just something to keep in mind moving forward. Is I think also their duelists and strategists tended to be a lot more offensive oriented, where their vanguards were defensive oriented, and I think they need to find a better balance or actually go all into playing an offensive style, because what we were seeing is that on their support line they weren't able to help each other out in the same way, and that same thing is true with their vanguards because there wasn't someone really pushing the same way. As however, I did want to say that I think both of the duelists did very, very good, especially in relation to the team's overall performance. Rising, for example, had the highest average damage and was number 4 for the KDAs overall, and had the highest damage average as a team, largely because Rising and Nectar really did carry on that front. Obviously, Rising is no longer on the team, but I still think that this speaks to both his and Nectar's talents as DPS, that they were able to put up this really good performance when the rest of their team wasn't, I think, working at the same capacity as them, is one of the points that kind of leads into why I think there is a different playstyle amongst the NA teams, because what we're seeing here is that Rising and Nectar were really able to pop off when the rest of the team wasn't, which I don't think would be able to happen on an EMEA team on the similar level, because their teams are built around the team being able to work together, whereas I think this shows that there is a lot more flexibility in the NA playstyle for individual players to really excel when the rest of their team isn't. My suggestion overall for them would be to figure out the roles and work on developing a cohesive playstyle that works with individual talents, and also work more on their hero pools, specifically for the vanguards, because once again, both of them do tend to play more defensive oriented, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is something that I do think they should keep in mind if they want to succeed more moving forward. I think the same is also true for their duelist, and I forget who the new duelist is actually, I feel bad, but I think it would be interesting if they could take on more of that offensive position so that Nectar is able to take more of an offensive route, because both Rising and Nectar were, I think, more offensive oriented players, and it would be really amazing to be able to kind of highlight Nectar in that way so that they're able to pop off. I think the same was true of Mori and Kurova. I think both of them are more offensive oriented in their picks, and once again, Rising and Kurova are still playing on the same team in Dark Zero, who was one of the teams to advance to Ignite Stage 2, so I'm really interested to see how they play moving forward. I haven't really looked at the stats for the playoffs, but I think looking and kind of doing the same analysis for the Stage 2 would be really interesting to see whether or not they kind of stay with their more offensive playstyles. For Techie, he played a lot of Strange and Magneto. I think this was more of the mixed offensive role. The same is true of Crimzo, who I think does have a more offensive style when he plays Captain America. However, his Captain America was getting banned out a lot, so I would like to see Crimzo deepen his hero pool a lot more so that he's maybe able to get more offensive power off of Venom or Emma. I also think he's been working on Angela a little bit, but we did see him a little bit on the group, but I think going with a more offensive style to complement Techie, who has the more of the defensive style, would be the way that I would suggest Crimzo to develop looking further. Nectar, similarly, they played a lot more offensive-oriented players, which is also the same for Rymazing. Rymazing had Phoenix as their most played character, and as we talked about before, Phoenix kind of has that mixed play style, whereas Nectar, their two picks were Wolverine and Bucky, which tended to be more of that offensive focused melee. Rymazing also did play a lot of Ultron as well, so there was some triple support action going on, which was done to complement Kurova, who played a lot of Adam as well. I think that is Kurova's best character and the one that he likes to play the most. I did also see him a lot as Luna Snow, more into that defensive playstyle, but I personally don't think that really works for Kurova's playstyle as well. I think when he was playing Luna, he was kind of playing a lot more in the action, which is similarly what Aramori was doing on Loki and Cloak. I think Aramori largely played Loki a little bit more. I think she's really amazing at Loki, but once again, having a Loki, an Adam, and an Ultron, all three of those characters are offensive oriented, and they all need to be really close to the action. Easily, I do lose control of the objective and also to be wiped out by your opposing team. Once again, we also did see a lot of double support ults between the two of them, and I think this has continued to still be an issue for Sentinels, so I do think that that is something that they should work on moving forward, but I am interested to see how Sentinels figures out these issues, especially with their new players, as they did miss qualifying for this LAN tournament, whereas Dark Zero, where Kurova and Rymazing are now playing, did actually qualify. So I'm very interested to see how the play styles for all of these players and their different teams. Moving on to Reject, I think their team performance was overall okay, but I think their strategists were pretty solid. However, but looking at what we outlined earlier about needing an offensive and defensive strategist, I feel like they were forced to play a lot more defensively, and with this in mind, they also played a lot of triple support. So when we look at the stats for they were the third highest overall for healing. However, this is because they played a lot of that triple strategist, because in comparison, when they were just two, they have the 9th highest, which actually makes them the second lowest. Comparatively as well, they were also the 7th for damage block. On top of that, we're also the 8th for the ratio of healing done to damage block. So despite the fact that they didn't block a lot of damage, they also didn't do enough healing to counter that as well. They also played against more similarly skilled opponents like Ground Zero and OUG, which kind of makes their situation a lot different than Nova and Sentinels, where they were playing against a lot more higher skilled opponents. I think overall Ground Zero did a better job at shutting Rejects down offensively, and honestly, watching this game that they played, I did think that Ground Zero was going to be a lot more of a contender moving forward in this competition because of how dominant I felt their performance was over Rejects. I think their tanks overall were a bit weak. Once again, they had some of the lowest damage blocked as well, and we did see some Invisible Woman being played. I feel like the fact that their damage blocked overall was very low is an indication that their tanks do need to pick up some slack, so to speak, and the DPS weren't really able to get anything going. I also think, kind of similar to a lot of other Asia teams, that maybe there wasn't as much of a grasping of the meta or what's being played in EMEA and NA. Personally, I am kind of sad to see that Oka is no longer on this team as well. I think it's really nice to see other girl players on professional teams, and sadly, moving forward to Ignite Stage 2, there isn't going to be any teams with any female players, as Mocha so far is not on any teams, and then Aramori, who plays for Sentinels, is not going to be playing, as Sentinels didn't make the cut either. I hope that Mocha is able to find a team that does work for her, and I'd love to see her back playing, and also I'd like to see Rejects be able to find a roster that works more for them. Another thing, this is their triple support was actually one of their vanguards, meaning that they were playing a 1-2-3 organization. I'm very surprised that that went through at, you know, such a high level of competition. Player breakdown, so Piggy, who was one of the vanguards, he was also the player that switched off to play support. I think they were largely playing Emma and Magneto, but the other vanguard was kind of playing the mixed offensive role with Captain America and Doctor Strange. I think this might have been an attempt offense out of the team because overall they were playing very defensively. Finale, who was one of their DPS players, tended to play the more aggressive role, offensive, with Wolverine, and then similarly Punisher. Punisher, I think, is one that does fall a little bit more into that mixed play style, just because I think Punisher is good at taking different angles, but also does so at a distance, but can also be played in a bit close quarters as well. Similarly, their other duelists played Phoenix. Then their supports also tended to play just one character, with Dobby playing Luna Snow, so more of that defensive role, and then Mocha was on Cloak and Dagger. I do think that both of them played Invisible Woman, which I did mention before, but Mocha playing as Cloak is a much more of that heal bot role, so I do think this shows that they were forced more on that defensive role because there isn't, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do think overall had a hamper on how well they were able to perform, specifically when it comes to generating offense. Ground Zero, I think they played significantly better than their number shows, and I think that this is largely because they have a very offensive oriented play style, which is very high risk, and in one game in particular came with very, very low reward, which was in their last game in the Citadel series, where they were almost completely shut down, but also by Citadel, who similarly has the same very offensive oriented playstyle, which we'll talk about more. Unlike the case with Nova, I decided not to remove these statistics, as I do think Ground Zero and Citadel was a very, very fair matchup, and I think when you actually watch that series as opposed to just looking at the stats, it does actually more sense, as well as when you look at the stats and do sort of the kind of game by game breakdown about it, you can kind of see what I'm talking about this high risk, high reward. Sadly though, I don't actually have statistics broken down by like game. I have it broken down by team, but overall they had the highest death toll, and I think that maybe working on their communication would help to better mobilize together. Once again, like I sort of mentioned at the beginning, Ground Zero no longer actually exists as a team, but some of their players are still playing together, and I believe with other players from Nova and maybe Rejects as well. So it will be interesting to see how that team plays, because they did advance to the second stage for the LAN. I think they were pretty solid against Rejects, and with exception of Nami, who was one of their DPS, I think they were pretty solid when it came to KDA. Nami had a 2.6 KDA compared to the strategists, which were 3.1 and 3.3, and then the Vanguards were 3.7 and 3.5. These numbers are overall a bit lower in comparison to teams like Envy and RAD, which were the best teams in the tournament, but I still think shows that they are somewhat consistent when it comes to playing as a team. They also had solid damage per kills and damage per final hits, save for Nami and Zenstari. I would like to see them work more on refining their play style, because I think there was a big disconnect, and also I think there might be some issues with disconnect when it comes to the meta. I think maybe they might have been at a bit of a disadvantage just because their server and their playoffs was done completely separate from the other like Asia regions, but I still think that they did have a pretty solid showing overall, and think that the stats don't really show how competitive I think they were. Individual character picks, we saw a lot of Magneto from Duep, who was more of their offensive role. Zenstari similarly had the Groot and Strange, which Groot was also defensive oriented, whereas Strange was kind of that mixed role. So I think Duep actually had like higher KDA and stuff like that, so that's why I gave him more of the offensive role. But once again, the player picks aren't really adding up, and so maybe that's something to work on moving forward. Nami, this was their duelist that had a couple of issues in my opinion. They played more of the defensive role with Phoenix and Punisher. Other duelists played a lot of Wolverine and Bucky, which once again are both offensive oriented picks. King Bob, who was one of their strategists, Luna and Invisible Woman, and then similarly the other strategist was Cloak and Loki. So these are more offensive oriented picks, because even though Luna is the, heal bot or defensive oriented play style, she's probably one of the ones that can get a lot more offensive output. Invisible Woman similarly is that playmaker character. Cloak and Dagger is the mixed role as well, and then Loki is the playmaker before. So I think their strategists tended to be a lot more offensive, which is kind of strange given that their Vanguard picks tended to be more defensive, which could have caused disconnect in terms of the team is OUG. I think overall they had pretty good teamwork stats, but their overall stats were kind of skewed due to lower standardized stats. But I think overall they weren't generating a lot of offensive pressure. Did pretty well when it came to getting together and playing consistently, but at the same time, nothing really stands out about them. Their stats are pretty consistent across the different roles, which shows that they are capable of working together, but also I think personally they can do a lot more to play their roles, because I think the stats should indicate a larger difference depending on the role. So they did have a low damage block per death, which shows that they weren't really all that good at defensive either, and were number 6 and number 7 for damage per kills and damage per deaths for Vanguards at number 9, and their assists for strategists was the second lowest. However, one of their duelists, Taro Cookie, was number 3 for highest KDA, which actually put him at higher than Taro, which I think is really interesting given that a lot of people do think that Taro is one of the best players, and I do think the stats do indicate that he is one of the best players. But while they weren't able to really generate offensively or defensively, they were still able to play together to stay alive. But ultimately, even though staying alive is a big thing that leads towards winning games, but is not the be-all and end-all. Similarly, I don't think there was a lot of difference between the offensive-oriented, defensive-oriented playstyles when it came to their individual players, which you can kind of see. One of their tanks went with the Emma Magneto duo, the other one was playing more Cap Venom, so yes, this was the dive-oriented, so more offensive. So I wonder if going with dive was even a good choice for this team. Duelists, I do think were able to get a lot of value. Taro Cookie, who we talked about before, was playing that sort of mixed offensive role with Phoenix and Psylocke, who tended to be big picks for this meta in particular. The same is true for their other duelists, who also had an offensive pick with Wolverine, and then I think a character who kind of fits more in that mixed role, which is Storm. I would kind of maybe put Storm more in the defensive end of the mixed spectrum, just because she can do like healing and also damage boosting, and typically the fact that she's a flyer does give her a lot more movability. They had sort of both playmakers and mixed roles, which I think is a bit odd that they weren't able to get as much offense. The offensive oriented supports with Loki, Invisible Woman, as well as Cloak and Dagger, who was once again able to put on the Cloak Terror Cape, as well as Luna Snow also has the damage boost in her ultimate as well. While I do think that they had a pretty solid showing, I do think it is very strange given their hero picks that they weren't able to generate the same offensive talent as other players were with the same characters. I would recommend that they start building new strategies to kind of counter the meta in other regions, and maybe try and devise things that works better for their play styles, like maybe going for more defensive picks, like putting less of focus on the strategist to produce offensively so that they're able to keep the duelists alive a little bit more. Might enable the duelists and overall the team to produce more offensively. I do think overall though that 100 Thieves is the best example of what I referred to at the beginning as the NA playstyle, as Terra and TTK both had the highest damage dealers with only Rymazing above them, showing both benefits and drawbacks of this playstyle. I think the teamwork stats are a lot more important when it comes to analyzing this team and their ability to play. Overall, their damage numbers were a lot higher than other teams, as were offensive stats like kills, assists, and final hits, yet their overall team performance, I would argue, was actually more negatively affected by their offensive skill. The team sort of takes on an all or nothing offensive approach that puts a lot of pressure on Terra and TTK to pump out damage, but once one player falls, the team sort of crumbles upon itself, which leads to the team overall having a higher death average, which is at 5.1, compared to RAD and Envy, which 4.5 and 4.9, so not much different. But on top of this, they also had a bit of an easier bracket, in my opinion. And then similarly, when they actually went against the higher skill teams, like in their series against RAD, their death totals were a lot higher. For instance, Terra was actually actually dying on average about 7 times per game, whereas Harvey, their support, was also dying 6 times, so that's higher than their 5.1 average. Similarly, a lot of their lower stats were far below the average, so their kills and final hits were number 7, which I think is supposed to be their damage per kills, and then damage per final hits were number 7, whereas their damage overall was number 2. So while 100 Thieves was very dominant when it came to the standard stats on the scoreboard, they had a lot more lower teamwork stats than either RAD or Envy, whose lower stats were usually closer in proximity to the top stats. Their stats appear a lot better because of their massive offensive talent. However, this comes with the caveat that they significantly reduce their ability to play defensively, hence the concerns regarding an all or nothing playstyle. As well, it does work in their favor when they are able to capitalize on this. When they fall, it can be a lot harder for them to adjust, and even when they adjust, I don't think they do it as well as other teams such as Envy, RAD, and Citadel. Defensive and offensive tank picks, TTK tends to go with defensive character picks despite playing an offensive oriented style, which isn't necessarily bad, but given how the meta shifts, there's a sort of small pool, especially with bans for the tanks, to choose which characters to play, which can make Vinny's role as the defensive vanguard a bit harder. TTK does spend a lot of time on point and does a good job at being able to stay alive, which does give him a good KDA overall, and for the most part his ability to get kills and final hits is good. However, in comparison to the amount of damage he is doing, his ability to secure kills and final hits is extremely low. I think he was in the bottom 10 for the Vanguard for final hits despite being the highest damage, and the number was 1.3, so he was doing about 1300 a final hit. Terra is actually similarly low at 1.23. Compare this to Enzo from Citadel, who was 0.4, so 400 damage, or Speedery at 0.88, which is 880 damage, or Trust Me at 0.92, which is 920 damage on average to get a kill. The damage per final hit, similarly, TTK was the 8th lowest overall with a 6.2. Typically the lowest would be the strategist player, so this is very, very concerning in my opinion. Vinny similarly was also the 5th lowest. Terra was not as bad at a 3.7, but was a lot lower than other DPS. For example, Cal, who was playing tank and strategist and DPS, was actually doing better for securing kills than Terra was only playing DPS. Overall, they were very low when it came to damage per final hits overall. They had high damage blocked as well, and I think overall the strategist did a really good job at keeping everyone up, but I think their playstyle, like we kind of talked about that North America playstyle, is really centered around keeping particularly Terra alive and then kind of falling back on TTK. For me personally, I think something like a triple support comp could be really useful for them moving forward. Having something like the Adam Res and the Mantis boost, I honestly think could make Terra and TTK unstoppable. Like, they already have two of the highest damage dealing players overall on their team, so having the Mantis boost on top of that, plus having either the Adam Res for Delena or possibly the Rocket Res for the other support as well, could really enable them to just pop off, because one of their biggest concerns is the amount of damage that they're taking. I also think that the reason why they had these issues on securing kills was because of their lack of ability to play together as a team, and I think by coming more together to support each other, that they'll be able to make this offensive talent actually generate more kills and final hits, which is ultimately the end goal of about character picks. TTK tended to play Magneto and Emma, who do tend to be more defensive oriented picks. I think my suggestion for TTK would be to work more on Emma. He does get a lot of value on Meg, and I think Meg is also one of the better character picks overall. Vinny similarly had some of these issues because wanting to take more of an offensive role and started playing more the Venom dive tank. I think this was particularly in their series against RAD to try and counter Trust Me. I think he has put in a lot of work in this moving forward to stage 2, as well as my kind of suggestion about triple support comps. They have been working a lot more on triple support comps, which I think sort of enables them to take on this more almost dual offensive oriented Vanguard approach, or at least having an offensive Vanguard that's doing the dive and then have a defensive Vanguard that can similarly get the same offensive output. Terra similarly kind of plays more offensively. I think his main pick tends to be the Bucky utility, but I also saw a lot of the Phoenix, and when he plays Phoenix, he does tend to go for the more aggressive or offensive oriented playstyle. Delena also similarly had more offensive oriented playstyle with Psylocke and Wolverine. So I think this was a big part of disconnect on their team, is that they weren't really accounting for where they needed more support and more defensive oriented style, which teams like RAD, for instance, were able to capitalize on. Harvey and Millennia, pretty solid for this team. Harvey, for the most part, I do think was focused more on keeping Terra alive. I think that moving forward, it would be interesting to see them develop more of the triple support comp. I think with what they've been doing so far, Millennia, who was actually more on the defensive role with Luna Snow, actually was taking on more of the triple support like Mantis Adam role. So I'm very interested to see how things evolve for this team moving forward. Moving on to Citadel, I think overall they have probably the riskiest play style. They're very, very offensive focused, but however, in contrast to a team like 100 Thieves, they actually work more equally, sort of with everyone generating damage, with high KDAs all around, and I think for the most part, with their level of offensive talent plus playstyle, they tended to be a lot more high risk, high reward in comparison to a team like Ground Zero, which also has a similar playstyle but tended to come with a lot more low reward, largely because I think the players on this team are just more consistent at being able to work together. However, their playstyle can be inconsistent and they fluctuate quite significantly due to their high risk playstyle, which often leads to higher death totals, though it's not the worst overall. And I think that they kind of counterbalance this. While they do have higher death totals in the games where teams are playing against them, that team also ends up having a higher death toll as well. I think they were overall one of the most consistent when it came to offensive output as well. They were number 1 when it came to damage per kills, and then number 4 when it came to damage per final hit. They did, however, lose their series to 100 Thieves, which shows that they might want to work on their defense a little bit more, as their healing per total team death was at number 7, and their healing per total team death restricted to strategist was number 9, which is their lowest stat overall. They did, however, have the highest assists, which does show that their supports were contributing overall to their team performance. Enzo and Polly also were really, really fantastic. Enzo, for instance, had the lowest damage per kills overall for any player at 0.4, and then Polly similarly was at 1.1, which is a little bit on the higher side, but is actually on the lower side specifically for the Vanguard role. Polly was still really good, but Enzo's stat is honestly really, really good. Enzo also played the defensive Vanguard oriented role, which I do think has something to do with why his damage per kill is a lot higher, because he's not going to be doing as much damage but is still contributing to the team kills overall. Similarly, Ken and Alex did a really, really good job as a support duo. They were number 3 overall for healing, but their deaths made their teamwork stats not as good when it came to things like the healing per total team death, which I don't think for the most part is actually their fault, because once again, their duelists are taking a lot more risky offensive angles, and I think that there just could have been instances where there was just bad positioning and whatnot that they just couldn't fix. So it's more about the communication with their duelists, and overall they also had pretty high damage at 8k on average, which my suggestions moving forward would be to work on their comms and know when to switch up their play styles. And I'm very interested to see how they will change to play with Melio, who is coming over from RAD, who I think is a pretty stellar DPS as well, which we're going to talk more about when we actually get to talking about RAD. I also think that their offensive style makes them one of the most dynamic and interesting teams to watch, and I think now that they have Melio as well, and they still do have Pokey and Tanuki as both their DPSs, who this gives them a lot more adaptability and movability as they're able to sub in different players. Melio is a bit more on that defensive oriented end in comparison to play and work more on their defensive end of their gameplay. Here they're like most played characters. Once again, Enzo tends to go for those more defensive oriented picks. I think Magneto was a bit more common than Doctor Strange, get a really consistent output when it came to damage per kill and damage per final hits as well. Polly as well really popped off on both Captain America and Emma Frost. I think he's probably one of the best Captain America players. He got targeted banned a lot though, but I would be interested in seeing more from him moving forward on this character. Tanuki, similarly, I think his most played character tends to be Torch, and Torch was banned out a lot, but I do think that he was able to get more of that output. I think might have been because they were targeting Poke's Captain America first, and so it was kind of a trade-off on whether or not you want to deal with. Something that really works in Citadel's favor is that they do have players who are really, really good at specific characters, which can affect the pick and ban rate, and does typically allow someone, one of the characters that they're very, very good at. Poke as well tended to be more offensive oriented with the Psylocke, but once again played a lot of triple support, with Ultron being one of their most played characters, which I do think is pretty consistent with the fact that they are a team that takes a lot of damage and does more riskier play. So once again, seeing them develop more on their triple support strategies would be interesting. Alex also similarly kind of has two characters here that are more offensive oriented. Invisible Woman is obviously the playmaker type character, where Luna Snow, while is that defensive role, is still a character who's able to get a lot of offense from her abilities. Ken similarly played Loki and Cloak. Cloak has the terror capability, which really was beneficial towards allowing their offense to pop off, and then similarly Ken also had the Loki, which allowed to get a lot more damage. Envy's stats overall, I do think, were the best out of the teams in this tournament because they were coming from the winner's bracket. And I think a lot of the times, specifically in this final series against RAD, and this has been talked about by a lot of people, is that I think they lost due to this pick and ban phase. I don't think that this is like overall the only reason why they ended up losing, as we're going to talk about RAD a lot more and talk about how fantastic they are at the fact that Envy, from the analytics and coaching and pick and ban perspective, was not able to identify the weaknesses in RAD's playstyle, did have an influence on them. Additionally, a big issue for them was not defending their DPS picks, specifically for Speedery, because the NA playstyle, as we talked about, is based around the DPS and supporting those high damaged dealers, and this is told from Speedery's average per damage, which changes overall from a 19k damage per 10 minutes to 20k damage per 10 minutes when just taking out the two lowest games that he had against RAD. I think with this being said, overall the DPS had a really fantastic performance. I think it goes without saying Speedery overall is the best duelist personally, but I also want to highlight that I think Cal is a very, very great asset for this team, as he plays all three roles, and also made it a lot harder to calculate his individual statistics. So I would take some of his stats, just keeping it in mind that there was no way that I could fully break it down to look at, you know, this is what his damage per kill is when he's on duelist versus when he's on Vanguard, because, or on support, because it just was too much to kind of break down that. I think, however, for their Vanguards, which once again I think they're both amazing, is that they can be a bit too aggressive at times. Kaluge in particular has a very, very offensive oriented playstyle, and we're going to talk about this. In this final series against RAD, we often saw Window actually being the one to switch to the dive tank, which left Kaluge as in playing offensively and Window also playing offensively. This put a lot of stressors on someone like Cal, who oftentimes in this case had to switch off to that triple support or change his whole play style, and I feel like that just overall really hampered his performance, especially because I think in some of the games that we were seeing, Window as dive tank was also the ones where Speedery's picks were banned out, which overall just like their offense was just not the same. And actually in those games it was actually Cal who was popping off as DPS, and I feel like Cal has been kind of mistreated in a lot of the discussion about Envy in this tournament so far, particularly that last series about RAD, because I really do think that there was a lot more pressure on Cal to kind of perform in certain situations when others weren't able to. I think there's similar adaptability concerns when it comes to their supports as well. Something that really struck me was the fact that Month relied a lot on Loki. My perspective on this is also that they just kind of were going completely with what the meta was, which is Luna Loki, and they weren't really making these changes to counter particularly RAD. They also relied a lot on triple support, and like I was saying before, Cal was treated almost like a fallback, and I felt like this probably hampered how well he was able to perform, just because he had to be a lot more adaptable than the rest of his team, as I didn't see changes being made by the supports, and while I did see changes being made by the Vanguards, I think those changes were actually done in a way that made it more pressure on Cal in particular to play that triple support role. Their lowest stat overall was healing per damage blocked, which was number 6, which meant that they're taking a bit more damage than their healing can really keep up with. Once again, the damage blocked kind of stat is one of the harder ones to measure because there's no difference between damage blocked and damage mitigated. But I think this is especially a concern because overall Kaluj was a lot lower when it came to damage blocked. He was actually the 6th lowest for Vanguards. However, comparatively, Window, who did play that more defensive oriented Vanguard, was the 2nd highest. If they're going to move forward with Window playing the more dive tank roles and widening his hero pool that way, I think that Kaluj also needs to adapt his playstyle to better complement that as well so that they're able to really remain consistent. Overall, they did have very solid damage per kills with Speederys at 0.88. Cal was about 1 or 1.1, I believe, and that's counting all roles. Window was actually at a 1.3 compared to Trust Me at 0.92 as dive. The number isn't fully different, and I do think that Window is still able to get a lot of value on the dive and also just as a player in general, but I think that Window and Kaluj need to figure out how to balance the offensive and defensive more, and while triple support is the meta, I think it will harm them overall to focus too much on it, as the supports need to work on keeping their team alive because the game is designed to be played in that 2-2 format. And I think in comparison to a team like 100 Thieves, where I think playing triple support would actually benefit them a lot more, I think it won't benefit Envy and will actually make them rely a lot more on individual players who I think can be banned out a lot more easily. And so I think this would also just be overall deepening their hero pools and then also figuring out lineups to kind of balance offense and defense. So if Window is going to change to Venom, for instance, to play the dive, maybe Kaluj wants to take on Strange or Magneto instead of playing Emma, who I think he plays the most offensively. I think Strange, he plays a lot more defensively. Making that switch could allow Kaluj to better take on that defensive role while also still getting a lot of offensive. I would also be interested to see them develop more and maybe rely less on DPS making the changes, as I think their DPS were actually the most solid throughout the tournament, and I think they need more support from both the Vanguards and the Strategists to kind of really solidify how well, because once again, I said this multiple times, but this onus for adaptability was placed on Cal, and I do, once again, because I've talked about the Vanguards a lot, I think Month was a big issue with not changing off that Loki. Kaluj was playing the Emma and the Strange. I do think Strange is more of the role that he should be working on. Window also tended to play more Groot and Magneto as well, but once again was making those changes to the offensive dive oriented playstyle with Venom. Speedery as well also has more of that offensive oriented playstyle. I think Psylocke was his main character for this, as well as Phoenix. Cal once again was playing like literally every single character in every single role, but I did see a lot of Star-Lord and Wolverine. Star-Lord once again is that more mixed player, and Wolverine is more of the offensive oriented. I do know that they did pick up another DPS player as well, so I think being able to communicate and sort of figure out a way to balance the different picks a lot more would be a measure for them to use moving forward. Month, once again, I felt like he was using Loki in situations where I don't think getting as much value. I also did see a lot of Cloak and Dagger from him as well. I think Cloak and Dagger is a pretty solid pick. As you can also see, Nero was playing a lot of Cloak and Dagger. So once again, that damage boost was really coming in handy. Nero's other character was the Luna Snow. So once again, getting the damage boost through the ultimate, plus being able to play more defensively. But I think there needs to maybe be a bit more adaptability on the support line, similar to what I was talking about with the Vanguards, which isn't overall to say that I think that they played bad, but I do think that this was what allowed RAD to really capitalize and secure a very decisive victory over them in the last series, which now we get to talk about RAD, which luckily is the last team. But RAD's playstyle is very, very team-based, and they play a lot and mobilize around the dive playstyle in particular, which does lead them to have a lower overall healing output due to the dive, because usually you're kind of relying a lot more on health packs, so you're being a lot more self-sufficient. Also with dive, there tends to be higher kills, especially getting kills on the strategist overall there's just going to be less damage that needs to be done to secure kills overall because you're taking out those supports. But I do think that they make up for this lower healing output and also lower damage output overall for all players by having more offense from their strategist, which led them to having on average higher damage and higher assists. A level 1 Crook, for example, had the highest damage of supports, while Fate was number 8, making them the highest duo. They also don't take a lot of damage. I don't want to say defensively, because we've been talking about the situation of the difference of offensive and defensive role picks, and I do think that level 1 Crook in particular does take on that offensive role, but I do think that they are very good at knowing when to pull back. Fate overall was the 3rd lowest player for deaths at 4, with Rajaro at 4.4, making him the 11th overall, and the number 6 for Vanguards, and top 2 when accounting for Nova's stat. Overall, I think their DPS had really good synergy. Both of them were actually able to switch between offensive and defensive really well. I do think Naga tended to play the more defensive oriented picks, whereas Melio tended to play the more offensive oriented picks. But once again, like I was talking about with Citadel, I do think that he is very, very capable of playing a defensive oriented duelist as well, which I think is going to be really beneficial for Citadel. Naga overall had very low damage block for duelist, which was number 5, and at 9, with the lowest actually being an 8.7, so he was only 0.3 higher for damage block. So in my opinion, that's a good stat because it means that he's playing a lot more cognizantly of how much damage he's taking and also being a lot more aware of his positioning. He had a very good KDA as well at number 5, which was 4.2. 1, 2, and 4 are the highest damage dealers with Speedery, Rymazing, and Terra. So I think that really shows how well he was able to play, because even though he wasn't in the highest for the damage output, his comparative stats of the KDA average does indicate that he is playing at the same level, that he doesn't need to produce as much damage to do it, which does once again relate to what we were talking about the difference between the NA and the EMEA playstyles, as Speedery, Rymazing, and Terra are all NA players. The other player that was in this was Taro Cookie. Similarly, Rajaro and Trust Me were number 4 and number 5 for KDA. Trust Me that actually made them the 2nd best duo. Rajaro was actually the highest for defensive vanguards when it came to KDA, and also had the 6th lowest deaths as well. Their damage per kill, Rajaro was at 0.91 and Trust Me was at 0.92, which made them the best overall duo for vanguards. Their damage per final hits, Trust Me was 2.9 and Rajaro was 3.3. Trust Me was tied for 3rd best for Vanguard and tied for 10th overall with Rymazing, who once again was the highest dealing player in the entire tournament. Melio was number 6 and Naga was 8th, which actually makes them the highest duo overall. The DPS was number 3 overall. One is Nova, the other Envy for damage per final hits, which once again, the Nova stat is the unadjusted one, which really only makes Envy above them when it comes to damage per final hits. Their support as well, they were the 2nd highest duo for KDA and were tied for damage per kills with Citadel, and number 3 for damage per final hits. They were the 2nd best when it came to healing, when only accounting for the strategist, and their healing for total team death with the strategist only was number 4, with only a 0.03 difference between the top team. Did have lower healing per player, largely due to dive healing, also because they didn't rely on triple support the same. They did play, I think, Mantis, Jeff Ultron in 1 or 2 games, but overall, they don't actually really need triple support because they are so good at staying alive as is and staying out of the line of damage, especially with their DPS players, who I think had some of the better examples of positioning throughout the entire tournament. Don't need as high stats because they can close the gaps between the roles a bit better than other teams are able to, and are able to mobilize a lot more as their team. I would like to see DPS maybe show up a little bit more offensively, but I still think they are overall the best team when it comes to teamwork. I do think it will be interesting to see how their team changes with Melio going to Citadel and how their new players fit in with the team as well. Do you think that they have been working pretty well together from what I've seen in the playoffs? But once again, here final time is the most played characters. Rajaro has Magneto and Emma, which once again, played very defensively for both of these characters. Trust me, Cap and Venom, dive oriented, obviously was the offensive pick. Naga as well, played a lot of the Phoenix. And Melio also similarly played a lot of Phoenix, and then also Punisher, which I do think shows how they both tend to go for those characters that have more like a mixed play style. Like, even though I included Psylocke as being more of an offensive character, I do think that because she does have a ranged attack, that she is able to be a bit more of a mixed role as opposed to a straight melee character like Wolverine or Bucky, which were consistently prominent amongst the NA teams. I do think for the most part Naga was playing a bit more defensively, just because I think better positioning and wasn't taking as much damage, whereas Melio I think did take a little bit more damage. Similarly, their support duo were some of the best when it came to generating offense. I think level 1 Crook overall, like, he was the MVP of this tournament, and I do think he truly did deserve this. I think his Loki was absolutely phenomenal. He had some games where his average damage that he was able to do, like, consistent or even more than his DPS, and also other DPS playing in the tournament as well. I think he also did a really good job at playing Invisible Woman as well. And then Fate similarly I think did a really good job at being able to stay alive and keep his team alive as well, because Crook was taking a bit more of those offensive and risky angles. Did lead Fate to kind of have more of a responsibility to keep the rest of the team alive. We also saw some pretty cool Jeff techniques coming from Fate, and we have seen a lot of Jeff being played in stage 2 of Ignite, which I do think in part is due to how Fate was able to get value off of this character. I do think he also played a lot of Cloak and Dagger as well, so once again that damage boost. Luna Snow has the damage boost as well. Loki was able to copy that as well. Here are the concluding results. So overall, teamwork stats were more accurate at measuring the placements of the team. However, lots of stats were dependent on deaths, so teams with higher death tolls such as Ground Zero got a bit screwed over. Similarly, a low number of games played makes the stats of one game worth a lot more. So for example, I did not end up using the adjusted stats for teams like Nova. So Nova's stats might be a little bit higher, which you can kind of tell that they're number 6 for the teamwork stats. So I could go back and kind of look at things. Honestly, on a time crunch to even get this video out in the first place, kind of a bit hard to determine whether higher, lower, or medium number is better for a given stat, and there can be some debate, especially if, you know, is higher damage block good or bad, or is it more rule dependent and stuff like that. But we can kind of see these were the average statistics, these were the average per standard, and this is the average per teamwork. So for example, RAD stats based on the standard are a lot lower than what their teamwork stats are, and I think for the most part most teams did have an improvement. Teamwork stats, I think 100 Thieves is one that we see a little bit of a decrease. I think the biggest difference is actually between OUG. Once again, we were talking about how their offensive, very good scoreboard stats, but when we actually look at the adjusted teamwork stats, they actually show up a lot better, which places them at number 5, which I think is a lot more consistent with their performance. I think that Nova gets a little bit of that boost because I use the unadjusted stats versus the adjusted stats, which I think would have made them a lot lower, especially when it comes to teamwork, because they had a lot lower deaths. Opposite is also true for Ground Zero, whose standard stats were a lot better than their average teamwork stats, largely because a lot of these teamwork stats actually depended on the death toll, and theirs was overall the highest. Here are the full concluding results. So this has like the teams, and then these are their individual stats, and then this is the teams with their number rating. So you can kind of pause this and read through it a bit more, because these were the statistics that I used. The high number is highlighted in the green, the low number is highlighted in the red. You can also see why I felt personally that GenG wasn't prepared for this. As you can see, they're the lowest in almost every single category. There are a few exceptions, obviously, but I do think I stand by my kind of earlier statements about this. I will also insert something at the end of this video giving you a full overview of every single one of the statistics sheets that I have, of which there are many. So that's why I haven't been like showing them as I've been going through, because it's a very complicated mess of things, and kind of brings us to the end of at least this talking portion. description. Once again, I'm gonna leave those in statistics. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave any comments and discussion down below. Also feel free to like the video, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, as well as any support would be appreciated, and also let's both me and the YouTube algorithm know what you want moving forward. The YouTube algorithm in particular is very finicky when it comes to these things, so interacting with this video in any sort of way does help to push it towards more people who might be interested in this content, as well as doing these things also lets me, as the person creating these, to understand what people want moving forward, as well as any comments are really appreciated, whether or not you have criticisms about things or just feedback, because once again, as I said at the beginning, I don't have any experience in anything like statistical analysis like this, and for me, I was really interested in doing this because I have been really enjoying watching the Marvel Rivals Esports, and I'm excited to see how the field evolves. I hope that by talking about these things directly with people and sharing my thoughts helps to kind of bolster that conversation so that others might feel encouraged to talk about things from this more analytical statistics perspective, as well as I haven't really been seeing a lot of this from content creators outside of really the ones that have been doing a lot of the LAN tournaments. And this isn't to say that I think I'm, wholly unique in doing these things, because obviously each team has their own coaches and analytics persons who are probably doing this on a much wider scale and know more about what they're talking about than I do. So don't take me as some sort of definitive authority, but I did really enjoy putting this together, even though it has been a very lengthy and kind of stressful process on my end. But once again, I do really appreciate anyone taking the time to have watched this video, especially to have stayed through to the end to listen to me just ramble, because once again, I think I've been sitting here for 3 hours doing this. So thank you once more, and feel free to stick around for the statistics at the end, and also feel free to stick around on the channel because I do have plans to maybe do this for the stage 2, as well as to do more videos talking about Marvel Rivals, such as video essays about some of my opinions on the lore and world building and characters, as I do really like the artistic direction that Marvel Rivals has taken with a lot of their interpretations of Marvel comics. So I have more ideas about stuff and would really appreciate it if people want to stay and support the channel. So thank you and goodbye.
time for me to start my TBR Harvest vlog. If you have no idea what TBR Harvest is, this is a readathon created by Leandra over at TBR Zero. She has a bunch of different ways to participate. One of them is a booktuber bingo, which I did give a prompt for. So much fun. But what I think I'm going to be doing is the pumpkin patch. This graphic is super adorable and it has a bunch of different prompts and different ways that you can participate. I'm going to be doing hard mode rather than advanced mode. So basically I will be doing the prompt with the associated color that goes with it. I don't think I'm going to try to collect all of the cats or ghosts, but we'll see. Like when I get close, I may end up changing my mind. But at the moment, the plan is only to do the hard mode. It's a little chaotic because there's no like official start or finish line, but I'm in the mood for a little bit of chaos. So we're going to do it this week. We're going to see how many prompts we can hit, how many ghost cats we can collect, and it's going to be a fun week. But first I had to pick where I was going to start, which was a little bit challenging, I'm not going to lie, but I ended up deciding because the cat paws like reaching out of the pumpkin were super cute, and you know, toe beans, we love some kitty toe beans. I decided to start with highly anticipated by a new to me author, or it just says new to you. I'm assuming she meant like new to me author or new to me book, I'm guessing. So I'm gonna go with Deathless Ones by Emma Ham. I have never read anything by Emma Ham before. This has a girl that is out for revenge, so she seeks the help of the god of death. It is my Patreon, a buddy read for the month of October, so I really need to get on it considering it's halfway through the month and I have not read it yet. And I'm really in the mood for a romantasy. I've been reading a lot of horror and I took a little bit of a romantasy break, and now I'm excited to jump back into it again. So that's where I'm gonna start. I have sprints going, so I'll check back in once I'm about 20 or 30% of the way through.
I feel like a fangirl, like I'm obsessed with it. It's made my life so efficient.
If my company ever took it away from me, I'd probably quit on the spot.
I will fight. Like, I will literally protest if you get rid of it.
It's something I love.
Oh, I have a Deathless update, but I have no idea where I actually am in the book. Everand did a new update, and so their app looks very different now. I think I like it because it shows me like the time left, and on my CarPlay it shows me how much listening time I have left, which I quite enjoy. I'm about 15% of the way through. I thought I was a little bit further into it than I actually am, but I have mixed feelings on it so far. On the one hand, I think that the world building is really interesting, but on the other hand, I feel like we're just kind of cooking dinner. On the other hand, I feel like it's just very surface level, and we're not really getting to understand any depth to it. We have the Deathless One god, and we know that all of the gods died, but I wish I had more information on why he's still around and what his what his deal is. How can he come to the mortal realm sometimes but he can't? And then they act like he was basically being tortured, but then we're not mentioning that again, and it just feels a little, I don't know, all over the place of sorts. I do like her point of view significantly better than I do his. His feels a little bit dry, and hers definitely feels like it's more of I'm reading a book rather than being told something. Because his is just it's very punchy, and I think that's intentional because he is a god. He's not supposed to have a lot of emotion, but it feels, I don't know, just not loving the writing style. I think that the plague stuff is really interesting, but again, we just kind of started off saying there was this plague, but I don't really know a lot about it. They act like they could be zombie-ish if you catch the plague, but then there's not a lot of detail, and it just feels really repetitive at the moment. So I think there's things like there's potential for me to really enjoy it there. There's definitely something there, but at the moment I'm just kind of like, you've told me that already. Let's get to the plot. Let's get to the point. Something to make me feel a little bit more invested than I currently do right now. And I don't know if that's the writing style or if it's just the narrative. I'm not really sure. But I'm gonna go cook dinner. I'm making, it's a HelloFresh meal, but it just basically, you put everything in the pan, stick it in the oven, which is my favorite kind of meal because I've been feeling very, very lazy recently. Well, you can see a little peep of Wilder, but I'm gonna go do that. And then tonight is Dancing with the Stars night, so I'm very excited for that. I think it's dedication night. It should be a fun one. I have some bad news, friends. I have DNF'd the Deathless One. I was so excited for this book, so I'm really disappointed because I thought that it was gonna be a new favorite. It sounded so interesting, like something I would absolutely love. And I got about halfway into it, and I don't care. I think that this is really, really slow. The pacing started off way too fast. Like, we started off with a huge bang, but to the point where I never really understood her as a character before the plot kicked off. And there was like this coup, and there was a wedding, and then all of these things happened in the very first chapter. And I feel like we didn't really get time to like sit with that and process it before she was being sent to the Deathless One to be resurrected, which is the whole plot of the story. And I needed that to be a little bit more drawn out and to show me more things rather than just tell me she wants revenge. I want to see that a little bit more. And then the whole premise of this book is this girl on revenge. She has come back from the dead for vengeance, and it is so incredibly boring. She is literally just wandering around aimlessly trying to resurrect the Deathless One while also not, and being in this hut with this other woman. And it just is very repetitive. I've been told the same thing like 45 times about her being a certain kind of witch, and then like their chemistry is not really working for me. There's only really been 3 characters that are prominently on page, so it feels very boring and isolated to just those 3 characters. I don't feel like there's any development, and unfortunately I feel like if I kept on it would be closer to a 2-star for me, which just bums me out. Because I was very hoping that this would be a huge win for me, but it just unfortunately is not working. So for our next roll, we got a 3, which landed us on a series read, and the hard mode for this one was a poll pig. So I did give my Patreons 2 different options of books that I needed to continue on in the series. The first one was Princess of Blood by Sarah Hawley. This is the sequel to The Servant of Earth, which I'm very, very excited about. I gave the first book a 4.5 stars, so I'm really hoping that I love the sequel. And it has like a few horror elements to it, so I think it would be a good like autumn read. The second one was Eldrick by Carrie Lake, which is the sequel to Anathema. Definitely a great spooky October read. It is very, 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 very long. It's like 800 pages long, and it does not have an audiobook, but I remember loving the atmosphere, loving the unique world building and magic system and horror elements and creatures and the romance and everything that was going on in the first book. It was a little bit slow, which was not my favorite, but aside from the pacing being a little bit slow, I loved everything about it, and I still think about that book. So I definitely wanted to give them that option as well. I was a little scared of it because it's 800 pages, and we're trying to read as many books as possible in this vlog. But of course, they were helping me out and decided to go with Eldrick. So we will be reading Eldrick by Carrie Lake, and it's gonna be a chunky one. It's definitely gonna be a chunky one. It is an eyeball read for me, so I think I might do one more roll to see what we can get next, and maybe that way we'll have like an audiobook to go along with my eyeball read, because I don't anticipate Eldrick being a book that I can just finish really, really quickly. I think I'm going to need to take my time with it. It is a slower paced story. I know that this one is dealing with the trauma and the backstory of Zavander, so I anticipate it also being a very heavy emotional read as well. So I think I'm gonna want something in between that we can do that I will also be able to like read and enjoy. So my next roll, we got a 6, and that moves us to a cozy activity, which is not a book, but it definitely is something fun that is included on the board. It was another poll pick, so I gave them 2 options for this one as well. Patrons were getting lots of polls. One of them was for me to work on my genre blanket, which I am a little bit behind on, not terribly behind, but just a little bit behind. And I was gonna watch like an episode of TV or YouTube or something while I did that, or to participate in a 5K for breast cancer awareness. October is breast cancer month. My mom had breast cancer last year. She is doing fantastic. She is in complete remission, cured, but we do like to do this every year just to give some support back, to give some donations back to go toward breast cancer research and funding and things at our local hospital. So either way, I was going to be doing that, but I wanted to include it on the poll because I knew I was going to be doing it and thought they might choose that one, and they did. So it felt just like a very cozy, happy day because we're celebrating life, we're celebrating survivors. I was able to spend some time outside and hang out with family. I am back from that now, and my hips hurt so bad from walking that. I didn't run it. I'm not a runner, but I'm also not used to doing that much walking. I've been working out, but that's more like lifting weights, not using your hip flexors. So Grandma Mel is showing today, and I'm hurting, but we had a great time. It was a lot of fun. So I have completed my cozy activity. I don't feel like we need to do exactly 3 rolls in this exact vlog clip, so I'm gonna go read a little bit of Eldrick, and then we'll probably do another roll for another book, but that will at least like get me kicked off and started, and then I can decide what my like pairing book is going to be. So I've gotten to 20% of Eldrick, and I don't know what it is about this book. There's something that is keeping me from wanting to pick it up, and I'm not minding it when I'm reading it, I am actually enjoying it when I'm reading it. I do feel like there is a few places that have been a little bit slow. The present day time, like verbiage, the dialogue feels a little bit stilted, but I'm hoping that will kind of settle in because I don't remember that being an issue in the first book in the series. I like the creatures, I like the lore, I like getting a little bit more of Zamander's backstory. I think it's just, I know that I am low on time and I'm going to be leaving soon and I've got a lot that I want to do, and this book is 800 pages long. So I think every time I go to pick it up, I think about how much I have left to do, and it is putting me into a little bit of a slump. I'm not gonna lie to you. So while I'm enjoying it, I don't think I'm enjoying it to its fullest capacity because I just feel very overwhelmed right now, and I've done that to myself by procrastinating for as long as I have. I am definitely feeling it. So in order to be nicer to myself, I think what I'm gonna do is put a pause on Eldritch for now. I will give you guys a little bit more thoughts before we leave here, and then I will put it in a future vlog for the rest of the month when I do feel like I can just kind of chop away at it, and I think that will help because I am enjoying it. Eldritch, though, is the second book to Anathema, which is following Mavis, and she was found at the edge of the Eating Woods when she was a baby, and so they brought her in, but unfortunately nobody really trusts her because where did this baby come from? And the Eating Woods are a very scary place. You don't go into the Eating Woods or you might never come out. She's been raised alongside her sister, which is not blood related, but they are sisters, and her aunt has decided to marry her off. So when she tries to get her and her sister away from that, she ends up going through a portal into another world. And I really liked the horror elements to the first book. I really liked the found family aspects. I thought that the world building was really cool. It definitely has a much slower, more gothic pace, which I knew going into Eldritch, it kind of follows that same lines of Anathema, but I am missing some of that found family aspects that I liked so much about book one, because right now our characters are isolated to themselves. Something has happened and they're in a place where it's just the two of them at the moment. And while we're getting flashbacks and things to Zavander's past, I want that to play into the story a little bit more because he definitely has trauma, so I'm enjoying seeing that, but I just wish that there was more happening around them and some of their moments together felt a little less forced. I think that's where I am right now. So I still like the writing, I still like the world, I still like everything that I liked before. I just want more of what I liked before, and right now I feel like she's just doing a lot of setup, which in an 800 page book, I'm only 120 pages in at 18% or whatever I am, so there's still a lot of setup going on at the moment, and I think that will get better, but right now I just don't think mentally I can handle that long of a book knowing that I already feel very overwhelmed. So I did another roll and I ended up with comfort genre, and I picked a book that is in the romantasy genre but is also young adults because I felt like that was going to